This is a Bob story. This is part 1 of 5. This happened at St. Barnabas Church in Falmouth, Massachusetts. So who's Bob and why do you care? Well, the reason why you care is because I'm telling the story. And B, or more importantly, who's Bob? Bob is a seminal figure in my life. If it weren't for Bob, I pretty much wouldn't be here. Now, I tend to say that a lot in these stories, but the reason why Bob's a seminal figure is because he changed the course of my life in multiple ways. We'll get to that in part 5, but this is part 1, and this is the introduction to Bob, as it were. So, before we get to Bob, got to do a little business. 1, if you like this stuff, please remember to hit the like button down below, and then right next to that is the subscribe button, because there's a whole bunch of content, whole bunch more content that is sitting there. And last but not least, while you're there, you might want to hit the notifications bell to be notified every single time I upload new content. Which reminds me that this is user-supported content, which means Mr. Miles is flat broke ho, and there's a link down below for Patreon, or what you're seeing there on the screen says Patreon, and Mr. Miles is broke. I could use about $3, $5, $7, whatever you can afford. Trust me, it'll put food in the stomach and gas in the tank so that I can continue to tell stories just like this one. So if you're interested, please see the link down below for Patreon. Click that and then subscribe for $3, $5, $7, whatever you can afford. Trust me, it'll go a long way. All right, let's get into the Bob story. A little bit of backstory. This story happened right after the end of Godspell. I was the lead in Godspell, and the play had just closed. So this is the beginning of July, and it's like 80 degrees out. This is kind of sort of important to the story. Bob was the sexton of St. Barnabas Church. And if you don't know what a sexton is, the sexton is kind of sort of like the groundskeeper. They're also the property manager. They basically run the joint. Nothing happens on that property without Bob knowing about it. So Bob needed an assistant. The rector of the church, who was an old friend of mine, because I had saved his son from an ass whipping that he rightfully deserved. When the play was over, because he was the rector of the church, he said to me, "Do you need a summer job?" And I said, "Do I? Of course I need a summer job." So he said, "Well, we need an assistant sexton. Do you want to do the job?" And I'm like, "What's an assistant sexton?" So he told me what a sexton was, and I'd be his assistant. Okay, sounds like fun. So do I need to fill out an app? I said, and he said, no, that was the app. And I said, "Do I need an interview?" And he said, "No, this is the interview. You hired." Okay, so we walked across the parking lot to the shed, and Bob's out in the shed. And I shake Bob's hand and I introduce myself. He shakes my hand and introduces himself. And the rector says, "All right, you boys play nice now." And off he went. So there's a chair there, and Bob says, "Have a seat." So I sit down and have a seat. Bob says, "I'll be back in about 4 hours." And true to his word, he comes back in 4 hours and says, "All right, it's lunchtime, go get some lunch." So I go out, get some lunch, come back, and sit down, and he says to me, "I'll be back in about 4 hours." And he disappears. And I said, "What do I do for the next 4 hours?" He says, "Have a seat." So I sit down, and sure enough, 4 hours later, Bob comes back. He says, "Well, that's the end of the day. That's 5 o'clock. I'll see you tomorrow morning at 9. Okay. So Bob heads off to the rector's office, or to the office for the rectory, to pick up his wife Lois, who's again the office secretary, because they've been married for 43 years. The rector comes out and he sees me walking towards the rectory to go get my bag. He says, "So, how was your first day?" And I said, "Well, fine, aside from the fact that I basically sat there for 7 hours." He said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, Bob didn't have me do anything." What? He said, "Yeah, I basically sat there for 7 hours." He turns on his heel. He sees Bob coming out of the rectory with Lois. And this is one of those conversations where you see it from a distance. So it's wah, 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 but you don't hear anything. And all I see is the rector doing this, gesticulating, pointing back at me, and I'm like, whatever that was. So Bob comes over to me and he says to me, "I'll see you tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Okay. So I show up the next day at 9 a.m. Bob says, "Have a seat." I sit down. He says, "I'll see you in about 3 or 4 hours. He comes back at lunchtime, says, "I'll see you in an hour. Go get some lunch." So I go get some lunch. I come back and he says, "Have a seat." And I sit down, and He says, I'll see you in about 3 or 4 hours. Same thing. And this goes on for a week. You know, the rector is just like losing his top. This is one of the calmest, sweetest people on the planet. Bob is just not paying him any mind. He's running the show the way that he sees fit. Unfortunately, fate would lend a hand at this point. About a week later, what I gather from Lois, what she told me a month or so later, was that they'd gotten into the car, he drove her home, and when they pulled into the driveway, he slumped over. He had had another heart attack. The reason I was hired was for the same reason, because Bob had had a heart attack 3 weeks earlier. And the chairman of the church council, the rector and the assistant rector, about 40 other people, all convinced Bob that he needed an assistant. And that's the reason I was hired, to help him and to do all the heavy lifting stuff so that Bob could continue to work. Bob wasn't having any of that. But fate lended a hand, as it were. Bob slumped over and Lois took him to the hospital immediately. He recovered, and that's when Lois laid down the law. And it went something like this. I've married you for 43 years, Bob, Robert, and I want to be here longer with you. That was enough for Bob. You don't piss off Lois. So, next morning, I'm not kidding, Bob was right back at work. I walk in and Bob's already there. And he says to me, got a job for you. And mind you, I did not know what had happened the night before. I was completely ignorant. I was not in the loop. Got a job for you. I'm like, great, what do you want? And he says, you see that there mower? That there push mower? You're gonna take it out to the back 40. And you're gonna mow the back 40. But before you do, a couple of things. One, you see how clean it is? And that thing sparkled. I'm not kidding, it was like it was right off the showroom floor. He said, you see all these tools? All of them? You notice how clean they are? That thing had damn well better come back clean. Okay. 2, when I say the back 40, do you know what I mean? So there's the church, the chapel, the rectory, and then the backyard, only it's on a slope. I set to work. I got about 3 or 4 lines in when the assistant rector comes out and he says, what are you doing? I said, mowing the lawn. It's maybe 85 or 90 degrees and I'm 20 years old. He says, what are you doing? I said, mowing the lawn, like Bob said. He says, come with me. He drags me into the rector's office, and he says, you know what Bob has him doing? Rector says, no. Says, he's mowing the lawn. Okay, what's wrong with that? With the push mower in 85-degree heat. I've never seen, up until that point, I'd never seen exasperation quite so evident. It was, he says, come with me. I traipse behind him, behind the rector. He goes out to the shed, and I stop about, 5 feet from the shed, and there's Bob, and the rector has words with him. I'm not going to repeat them, because it was a little shocking for a rector. So, basically Bob said, I hear you. Now hear me. You hired him. I didn't get to hire him. He's your man. But as long as he's working for me, I will do things my way. The rector said, you know it's 85 degrees out there. He said, yeah, I know. All right, he can have the power mower. And the whole reason why this is an issue is because they had a sit-down mower. A huge, brand new sit-down mower. And I could have used that. It would have taken about a half an hour. That's not what was going to happen. So Bob conceded and I got the power mower. I was out there mowing the whole damn thing up until about 5 o'clock when Bob says to me, he comes out, finds me, and he said to me, I'll see you tomorrow morning at 9. He says, all right, just remember what I said. It has to be clean. Everything has to be clean, which means you're gonna have to take it apart and put it back together. I said, really? He said, yeah. So I finished mowing and I was so tired. I said, I'll come back tomorrow morning and do this, first thing. So I figured I was doing myself a favor by going in at 6 a.m. Bob shows up at 6:30 and he says, what are you doing here? I said, I'm putting it back together. He So I had taken apart the push mower, washed that clean, re-oiled it. That was easy. The mechanical engine, on the other hand, that was a little bit more challenging because I had to take the blade off, had to take the cover off, had to take the gas tank off, had to clean out the inside, clean out the oil, drain it, make sure that it was fine. And I had never done this before in my life, but I just kind of sort of figured it out. I mean, it's only a 2-stroke engine, but it's not that hard. So, or at least not 1984's engines. I cleaned it, put it all back together, and then I figured, you know what? I probably should ask Bob if I'm doing this the right way. So I go find Bob, bring him back, said, did I miss anything? And he looks it over. He said, did you turn it on? I said, no. He said, well then, turn it on. I said, but if I turn it on, that means I'm gonna have to clean it again. And he just looks at me and says, yup. So if you're thinking that this is really harsh, if you're thinking this guy is like a boot camp sergeant, he's not. I'll explain. So basically what he was doing, he was testing me out to see whether or not I was competent, capable, mechanically sound, if I could figure shit out on my own, reliable. That's what he was doing. He didn't say that, but it was really obvious. And I didn't want to do this stuff just to, please the rector. I wanted to do it because, I wanted to prove to Bob, and mostly to myself, that I actually do this stuff. I'd never lifted a wrench in my life, but as my mother used to call me, she used to say to me that I was Mr. Fix-It. What's Mr. Fix-It? She'd bring home something new and I'd take it apart. And then I put it back together again. It didn't always work the same way, though. There might be a few screws missing or a few extra screws that weren't there before. So when she called me Mr. Fix-It, it was not a term of endearment. All right. So I move it over to a patch of grass, and he stood there and watched me move it over to a patch of grass and to see whether or not it ran right. And it did, ran just fine. And then he turned around and he comes up to me and he says to me, all right, well then, clean it up. So I spent the next 2 hours taking it apart, cleaning it, put it right back together again. Learned how an engine worked. All right. So that was my first introduction to Bob. It's a lot, I know. He sounds, I know, like a drill sergeant. He's not a drill sergeant. He was just, like I said, he was trying me out. And he just wanted to make sure that I knew what I knew. And if I didn't know it, then he'd basically have to sit there and handhold me. And he was capable of doing that. He just wanted to see how, he basically dumped me into the deep end of the pool, as it were, and wanted to make sure that I knew what I knew. And if I didn't know, then he'd help out. But I didn't know that at the time. I learned that later on. Bob was really a sweetheart. He really was. I know it doesn't sound like it, but, he's like one of those guys that's soft-spoken, salt of the earth, doesn't say something unless he means it, and he's just grounded. You don't fuck with him. He doesn't lie. He doesn't deceive. He doesn't manipulate. He's just Bob. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. That's just Bob. All right. So that was my introduction to Bob. That is enough yapping for today. This is the end of part 1 of Bob. Part 2, more Bob stories, and they are coming. If you like this stuff, you like how it works out, you like hearing about Bob and the rest of these stories that I'm yapping about, please remember to hit the like button, and then right next to that is the subscribe button, and right next to that is the notifications bell to be notified every single time I upload new content. Cool beans. Oh yeah, and this is user-supported content, which also means that Mr. Miles is like a po and needs some help. So if you can donate whatever you can, please hit the link down below for Patreon, and that will help me out with food in the stomach and gas in the tank so I can continue telling stories just like this one. Thanks a bunch for watching, and I look forward to seeing you somewhere on the road.